So, good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Skinner, founder of MarketingKind, and welcome to this MarketingKind exchange, where we'll be asking what are the alternatives to capitalism with Daniela Barone Soares, with Sir Tim Smit, with Professor Tim Jackson, and with my co-host, fellow MarketingKind member, and co-founder of Atticus, Claire Kennedy.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to have so many of you joining us today, and I'm very aware that there's several of you on this call who are new to MarketingKind. So before we crack on with the main event, I'd just like to give a very brief introduction to MarketingKind. We're a community of marketeers and change makers who believe that as most of the world's problems depend on human cooperation for their resolution, there are also marketing problems in disguise. So we have an opportunity and a responsibility to use marketing to create the change we'd like to see in the world. As the MarketingKind community, we do this in several ways. Firstly, and practically, by upcycling our skills in support of inspiring charities and social enterprises through our volunteering platform and our regular Coffee with a Cause gatherings. And later in the conversation, we'll be hearing from Scott Britton, the founder of Battle Cancer, which is the cause that we'll be working with this month. We look to take a more conscious approach to all the change we lead. So we coach and support each other in becoming more purposeful and impactful leaders through our digital fireside and our Your MarketingKind gatherings. And in recognizing that the systems of which we are a part are themselves shaped by the stories we tell each other across society, we also come together through our exchanges, such as the one this afternoon, to explore some of the bigger stories that we live and work by and how we might change those for the better.
Yeah, and of course, there are a few stories bigger than the story of capitalism. We clearly owe a huge debt of gratitude for the gifts that capitalism has brought. It's been estimated that standards of living have risen 10,000-fold since the birth of capitalism. Steven Pinker has, of course, argued that broadly there's never been a better time in human history to be alive. And proponents of capitalism could argue that the freedoms at the heart of capitalism probably contain our best hope for the future, that we need more capitalism, not less, if we want to include more people in its benefits. And what we should most focus on right now is to accelerate our way through the challenges that we face. Now, on the other hand, critics of capitalism might say that if it were an algorithm, that algorithm has developed a pretty serious glitch, with economic progress that drives climate change, resource depletion, inequalities, that's incapable of managing the ethical dilemmas posed by new technologies, that leads to fragilities through global flows of finance that can seem increasingly disconnected from business and societal realities. There are concerns over concentrations of power that can distort democratic processes, insufficient care and attention for collective goods and well-being, and a compounding of historic and racial unfairness. The world's 26 richest people now own more wealth than the bottom half of the total population of the world, and those kind of statistics are getting worse. Now, while it has been claimed that it would be easier for most people to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, you could say that right now, due to the pandemic, we are emerging from a huge experiment in ending capitalism, with on the one hand, the lockdown and everything that's had to come to a halt, and on the other hand, emergency measures that have closely resembled quite radical ideas such as universal basic income and a straightforward expansion of the monetary supply rather than government borrowing to pay for those measures. And all while, as a business community, we were already processing the idea of a proposed shift from a shareholder model of capitalism to a stakeholder model of capitalism. So have we arrived at a huge turning point where we're ready for an alternative to capitalism? Or should we be focusing on alternative ways of practicing capitalism? What should these alternatives look like? What might the implications be for society, the economy, the kinds of businesses, brands, and social change organizations that MarketingKind members are involved with? Now, often in these kinds of conversations, you can get stuck between either acknowledging the full extent of the challenges, but not having a practical response, or focusing on the practicalities and the practical things that we can do, but overlooking the true extent of the challenges. Now, we believe we may be rescued from that kind of dilemma by a wonderful panel of guests who are both radical and practical.
So a big introduction there for three fantastic guests. I'm very, very delighted to be able to introduce them to you this evening. First off, we've got Sir Tim Smit, KBE, Executive Vice Chair and co-founder of the Eden Project. And since its opening in 2001, over 22 million people have visited Eden, bringing over £2.2 billion of tourism to Cornwall. Tim has initiated the Live 8 Africa Calling concert at Eden and the Big Lunch initiative to build and celebrate our communities nationwide. He is also executive co-chair for Eden Project International, which aims to have an Eden Project on every inhabited continent by 2025. And in the middle of our Tim sandwich, we have Daniela Barone Soares, who's pioneering CEO of Snowball, a diversified multi-asset investment vehicle that aims to create positive outcomes for people and planet while generating sound financial returns. She is also a non-executive director of Intercontinental Hotels Group and Halma PLC, as well as being a trustee of the Institute for the Future of Work. And The Independent on Sunday included Daniela as one of the 100 people doing the most to make Britain a better place. And last but by no means least, we have Professor Tim Jackson, former chair of the UK Sustainable Development Commission, director of the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity and Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of Surrey. He is author of a Financial Times Book of the Year, Prosperity Without Growth, as well as the very recently published Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism. So he's incredibly well educated and informed to help in this conversation. He's also an award-winning dramatist. So welcome to you all.
Yeah, collectively you have a lot of authors. So welcome everyone. We're so grateful to have you with us. And what we were hoping to do to start would be to get a sense of your headline responses in terms of, at a headline level, what kind of, what would you propose either as an alternative to capitalism or an alternative for capitalism? So Tim Smit, perhaps we could start with your perspective as founder of the Eden Project. What would your headline take on our question be?
Well, my headline take would be sort of slightly mischievous, that it depends whether you're talking about a numbers game of taking people out of poverty or whether you're talking about an effective democratic way of taking people out of poverty. I mean, we have a number of projects in China, and I noticed that in the West we skate incredibly quickly over the fact that China over the last 70 years has taken about 700 million people out of poverty, which is a far greater achievement than I think capitalism in its strict sense has. Although one of the jokes about China is that it's called a one-party state and it's a communist party that's in charge, but it's the most chameleon-like political party you've ever seen, on the grounds that it is ranges from Stalinist communism to Harvard-based capitalism to a modern equivalent of almost a social democracy meets social enterprise, leaving aside the lack of democracy. I actually believe that there are a number of confusions at the heart of all this, one of which is the fact that those of us who might say that we approve of capitalism have been pathetically weak in enforcing a kind of moral compass on the world of capitalism. We have allowed a whole range of things to happen, which I'm sure Tim will speak about far more eloquently than I. But we've created a kind of illness where we talk about natural capital and the monetizing of a natural capital, which is essentially using human-made parameters to then evaluate things, against actually the benefits of the world of nature. And what is interesting at Eden, for example, is we've been experimenting with language a lot. You can watch people's eyes just disappear and go into the back of their head when you talk about sustainability or CSR as was, or ESG as is, and any number of the comfortable jargon-esque based approaches to being resilient or regenerative, because we actually live by lies. We live by a lie, which is that we can continue growing, that it's okay to do less bad rather than be objectively good. And I just think we've actually been very lazy. And I think the duty of capitalism, if we were to be on the side of capitalism, is to reinstate a kind of moral compass at the heart of it about how surpluses are judged to exist, And most importantly, do we collectively believe that those things that are gathered together under that phrase, the commons, should be viewed as morally protected in such a way that if you run any companies that impact on those commons in a negative way, it is treason to the rest of humankind, or the rest of the species on the planet, which leads you to things like ecocide and stuff, which I didn't intend to actually even discuss. So, but your question is about capitalism. I cannot see how without capitalism we can achieve what we need to in terms of redressing the wrongs of capitalism. Therefore, it's a kind of paradoxical situation. And one of the problems that people who are environmentalists and whatever have is that we carry our own baggage. We're terrible. We're just as bad as everybody else in terms of taking our prejudices along with us. So that the conversations, which are quite interesting, are: do you believe that all the charities you know that are about clean water, for example, do you believe they're capable of delivering clean water? And the answer is a loud no, they are not. Therefore, what is it? Who are the people who are going to start the conversations with companies like Aramco, Exxon, BP, Shell, who've got project managers, who've got drilling capacity? How do you create a completely new conversation which is shorn of its political weighting and freighting to do with an economic system, and bring it back into a kind of in the national and international interest? Strangely, I'm answering the question, but I'm actually really looking forward to the answers of my fellow panelists who are far smarter than I. So I shall now duck out, having talked about my only contribution to the conversation is about a form of moral compass at the heart of capitalism. And now the erudition will start.
Well, I was just going to pick up on that moral compass point, Tim, because going to Daniela, I was just interested in your work at Snowball and whether actually that is what you're trying to do, getting the moral compass back into investing. So it would be interesting to hear your view on how impacting investing is on that.
Yeah, I think sort of, I mean, you said it so well. I don't have anything to disagree with what I just heard. From a practitioner perspective, in terms of Snowball, we try to be the change we want to see. And this is more than offering a financial product. This is about thinking of how can we reform financial systems that are short-termist, that are extremely focused on one stakeholder only, which is the shareholder. And it's a fallacy, because basically what they are, what this is enabling is for us to devalue the work of everything else that comes into value creation, from the infrastructure, the social contract, the people that go into it, from the grants that government give to enable innovation. Every single piece of the pie is disregarded in favor of one part of it. And I think that's partly what has created this massive distortion and inequality within the current system, the current version of capitalism. So at Snowball, what we have done is really, first of all, to create a product that was already being thought through as a product that could be democratized and accessible by all. It's not today, because there are massive barriers to entry to offer a retail financial product. But the idea of it is that it's a product that could reach 1 billion people, to be a disruptor in financial systems, modeling this behavior. So we're legally bound to our mission, for example, and we've already put the governance in place as to when we can be a democratized retailer. The mission is carved into our articles of association with a very high threshold for any change in terms of that delivery of deep impact. And however, for this to be accessible for all and to be the norm, we need to offer something that is diversified enough so that it diminishes the risk and creates a more adjustable risk profile, a risk-adjusted return profile, that people could put a savings on it or their pension in it. And it also comes from a belief that people want to contribute to society, that people want, if they were given an opportunity to invest and to deploy their resources for at least to avoid harm and at best to contribute to solutions. So partly the other thing that we have put in place is, for example, in terms of our governance. So all our shareholders are non-profit organizations, which means that there will be no interest in selling Snowball to the highest bidder because there is no profit motive from behind it. The other thing is on remuneration, which is a big issue in the financial systems of today, which contribute to the misalignment in value distribution and in wealth distribution, which basically we have established a model that looks like the John Lewis model, a little bit more of a co-op in terms of distributing the proceeds of our management fee. Right now, of course, we haven't broken even yet, but the idea is that once we break even, our management fee will start to decrease with scale, so that the benefits of scale in our fund will be passed on to investors, because after all, it's their money. So that there is a lot in there that we have thought through in terms of modeling the behavior that we want to see in financial markets. And most important of all is actually, what are we funding? What are we financing? So the whole idea of ESG, for Sir Tim Smit was saying, CSR, ESG, sustainability, how is it done is the key question. ESG, really, just to clarify, ESG is concerned with the risks concerning environment, society, and governance to future cash flows. So only the financial risks. ESG is not concerned with the product or service that a company is doing. I mean, one of the shocking, well, it's not shocking given this definition, but Hargreaves Lansdowne, I think it was last month, published a list of the top 5 ESG stocks, and number 3 was British American Tobacco. Number 4 was Glencore, mining company. And it might be shocking for people that are investing in ESG portfolios to find those companies in their portfolios. But that's because ESG is concerned with the risk and not with the product that is being offered or service. And impact, as that's how we make that distinction. Impact is looking at what is the opportunity for investing in things that are contributing to solutions, that are creating a better story for what we want to see happen with our planet and with our society.
Wonderful. So we've had 2 really compelling opening views, from putting a moral compass back at the heart of capitalism and working through capitalism to correct some of the problems capitalism has brought, and also removing some of the inherent blindness in the current flows of finance, and really, putting a contextual vision back into those flows of. If I turn to you, Professor Tim Jackson, in some ways asking you to give a headline answer to the question, what are the alternatives to capitalism that you propose, is a little harsh, in that you've written a whole book on post-growth life after capitalism. Before that, of course, a whole book on sort of seeding the macroeconomics of a post-growth economy. But I'm going to make it even more unfair by asking you not just to give us your headline proposal, but could you also give us a sense, in so doing, of the degree to which the life after capitalism and the post-growth economics that you describe in your books, to what degree do you see that as a desirable endpoint in its own right anyway? And to what degree is it a sort of way of reconciling ourselves with something that's going to be happening to us anyway?
Oh, I like that question. I like it much more than me telling you what life is going to be like after capitalism. I mean, what I tried to do in post-growth was, and particularly in the life after capitalism bit of it, was to sort of unpack the bits of capitalism that go wrong. And I think there are a couple of obvious things. One is actually in the root of the word capital itself, which comes from capita, which is about counting sheep. Capitalism spends too much time counting stuff and not enough time on the poetry of life. And the other thing it kind of does is it spends too much time on kit, on technology, on building stuff, on physical resources. And that brings us into a mindset where we think that the good life is all about having and owning more and more stuff, because that's what capitalism does quite well. And that too is a bit of a mistake. So it kind of, in a way, life after capitalism is we don't count so much, or we don't counting as much as we do. We think poetically a little bit more. And number two is we just value our relationships a little bit more than we do all the stuff that capitalism is very, very good at producing. So, and to me, that's a desirable place to be. It's more poetic, more creative, it's more lively, it's more relational, it has more time for our friends and our family, it has the ability to develop human skills, it has the space for us to do nothing, absolutely nothing, when it seems like the right thing to do, and it has the ability to be a richer, more fulfilling life. I see it kind of life after capitalism. I see capitalism. I'm not against Steven Pinker thinking that capitalism has delivered lots of good things. We have to accept that's where we are. We are, in fact, in Western countries, very, very privileged, and we've got kind of material comforts until we don't even know what to do with discomfort because we're so used to being comfortable. And yet, somehow, we know that model is not very good for the planet. And ultimately, it's not that good for us either. So I do see after capitalism as being a place which is, richer in lots of different ways. Not necessarily monetary richer, but very definitely poetically richer, very definitely relationships are richer, very definitely our sense of meaning and purpose is an expandable commodity that has no limits whatsoever, that's not limited by the finite limits of the planet, and therefore is something really worth pursuing as a vision of social progress. And our job, kind of in getting there, it seems to me, is to sort of reform all of the things that we take for granted about our economic system, including, as Daniela has very eloquently said, the system of investment. I think that's when in Prosperity Without Growth, I kind of put forward this idea, which I'm just delivering really in a way to test Daniela's response to it, and Sir Tim's, of course, and it's this idea that actually investment, which we've seen as kind of just building up physical structures or making people richer or improving our technology, that investment is actually something much more fundamental than that. Investment is really the commitment of the present to the future. And I think that idea of investment as commitment is one way of doing exactly what I'm suggesting. We reach into economics, we look at all the dysfunctional bits, we take them out, we explore why they're dysfunctional, and we say, what should they be doing? Investment should not be a gambling casino. It should be our commitment to the future of our families, our children, of the safety of the planet, of the world that we live in, of other people. It's a commitment to the future. And as such, the kinds of work that those at the vanguard of sustainable investment, ESG, are doing is absolutely essential. But we have to sort of take that a little bit deeper, I think. We have to take that lesson a little bit deeper and ask, how is it that we can create that commitment? How is it that we can protect that commitment? How is it that we can stop investment becoming a kind of winner-takes-all situation in which only the rich benefit from it? How can we invest in work? How can we invest in the labor of ordinary people? How can we invest in the relationships that matter? And in particular, I think at this time, how can we invest in a health service that doesn't leave its workers living in precarious livelihoods with insecure wages and impossible productivity targets? Because that's the biggest lesson of the last year, I think, that we face at the moment, that capitalism, in all its forms, in all its forgetting of poetry, in all its forgetting of relationships, privileged the ownership of capital over the ordinary work that saved our lives. And that's a huge challenge, but I think that's where we are.
Claire and I were hoping to have a little bit of a focus on growth, because growth is at the heart of capitalism. It's at the heart of Eden. It's growing plants, growing the human spirit, at the heart of Snowball, at the heart of the ideas of growing prosperity versus growing GDP. Maybe we could, what's the right relationship, or, you know, building on your question, Tim Jackson, of testing the idea of investment as a commitment to the future, what's the right way of thinking about the relationship between a macroeconomic recognition that we may be in a post-growth scenario, particularly in mature Western democracies and so on? What's the way of reconciling that with the micro environment that the social entrepreneurs like Tim Smit need to have some kind of growth mindset? You know, he's not making Eden smaller than it was before. He's in some way got to make Eden bigger than it was before, and also for Daniela, in some way has to expand impact finance. So to any of you, what's the right way of seeing the macro and the micro in this context? Thoughtful silence.
I'm just waiting for Sir Tim or Daniela to tell, because in a sense, I mean, it is a challenge for them. I think each in their own place has a place, a niche in which there is room for some growth. We want the growth of ecological enterprise. We want the growth of sustainable finance. We want a place which is expanding those kinds of products and services, those kinds of investments, those kinds of experiences for consumers in ways which are sustainable. So for people in the right place, I think there is still a kind of micro growth-based model. But I think each of those examples has to kind of think about where they stop. You know, if you kind of get locked into, and I think you alluded to this a little bit, Daniela, when you talked about, you know, how you were going to spin out Snowball, if that's a phrase.
Snowballing a snowball.
Snowballing a snowball, exactly. Yeah, you're going to be really careful about, you know, hedge funds and global capital coming in to rip out the value of your company and take all the profit for themselves. So you are already thinking about that, and I think that's the right thing to do. I'd be interested in Sir Tim's sense of where the Eden project does or doesn't stop. On Mars, maybe there's probably some learning from the Eden project that Elon Musk would be interested in.
Well, isn't that an interesting question?
It's a provocation, Tim.
No, I know. I think it's really good. I was invited to speak at a space conference, and I've never met so many people I really wish did go to Mars. It was astonishing to see the hubris of wanting to go to Mars, to do to Mars exactly what you've been doing on Earth.
Right.
No self-knowledge whatsoever. I actually rather blotted my copybook by saying, why didn't they start in Burkina Faso, which if you were an astronomer and found a planet like Burkina Faso, you would actually explode in excitement. So prove that you could improve that first, and then let's go to Mars. No, I think this idea of growth is very odd, because I suspect, like you, Tim, and like you, Daniela, as I've started to look at, take growth out of it for a moment, at systems, I'm very interested in systems. I'd never had studied systems until recently. And last summer I went on a walking holiday with the guy who's the creative director at Google. And he said, the world is going to soon wake up to neural networks and understand the biggest mistake we've made over the last 30 years is that we put our faith in binary algorithms, which has actually taken us away from being creaturely and has actually given us a model of the world that's mechanistic, as if you like, its origins in the Industrial Revolution. And if you look at, say, the way that Eden has operated, I mean, we've grown in as much as we have grown like chain links come together and create something bigger and bigger and bigger, which is not the same thing as a cancer that gets bigger. And, well, I hope it isn't. And so the way I see Eden, the best example I can give you is we have a project in Costa Rica, which 30 years ago, it was 42 farms of 10,000 acres. It was completely degraded. A Danish guy who sadly died bought all of it. He put a fence around it, and he said, I don't want any human being in here for 20 years. I want the birds to crap it back to life. Now, today, we're running it, right? There is a 10,000 acre rainforest of such richness, you can't believe it. We had the excitement over the last 4 months of having had ocelots come back and puma come back. We've now got jaguar coming back. Okay, so that's just the natural world rebuilding itself with no humans. We're now talking with a whole bunch of people to create livelihoods in those forests in order to buy more land, in order to create more corridors for wildlife. The only way to do that is to create growth, if that's right, in opportunities to all the communities who would otherwise have found no livelihoods in those forests. But what's happened for them is that where for 5 months of the year there was drought and there were murders in access to water, now there are 4 rivers running 365 days a year. And there is enormous fecundity coming back to that area. And I was privileged to be in Paquera, which is the nearest town of 8,000 souls. And the mayor made this incredible speech about most humans don't have the chance of a second chance to see actually that living with nature is where the wealth was all the time. And then he went on this beautiful thing about, do you know what it's like having lived in a place of drought and death, to look up at the mountains and see every morning weather systems develop that you know will bring you rain, will bring you moisture and what have you. And if you look at that rainforest, the amount of wealth that can be created in that rainforest, which is both great for the ecology, but also for the community through, for example, wild shaded cacao, for example, certain types of fast growing timber tree and all the rest of it, they all want to manage this stuff because they've suddenly seen that actually living with nature is going to be so much better for them because they get tourism, they get productive crops, they get soil health. By having a lot of birds around, you get far fewer pests and diseases and so on. There's this virtuous circle. And one of the questions I'd like to ask the two of you is, have we been rather blind in allowing ourselves to look at, say, cities and doing that and maybe it's a boy thing rather than a people thing, but where we look at each individual thing and want to mend it without realizing we should be mending these things and creating them as a whole, and they work as systems. I'm a novice in this area of systems understanding, but I know, Tim, you're a wizard with all of that stuff, and you, with your impact investing, will also be a wizard with that. So can I pass the ball over, stage left, to well, whoever goes first? Tim,
I mean, it's interesting.
Man, and he won't go first.
Yeah, I find it very, very interesting because, for example, how do we put the incentives, just following up from your point, for the Brazilian Amazon? I'm from Brazil, and, and the need to export cattle because people want to eat it here and other places, and in China mainly, actually, the Chinese prosperity that buys beef from Brazil is what leads to the burning of the Amazon forest so that it becomes a ridiculous wasteland for cattle to grow in. Mm-hmm. So that is very sad. And I think, sort of when we think about growth, we need to put in context the sort of, the more developed world where we've already almost eliminated all the forests and everything else, and the places where it still exists, and where there is such a rich biodiversity, and what can we do to and in fact, to some extent, is having the courage to pay for it somehow, and monitor and police it so that those things don't, we don't need to wait another 20 years, for it. I think the whole, when I think about growth, the key argument against growth is the finite resources of our planet, and I think on that front, how do we do it so that we don't tax the poorest, so that the poorest don't shoulder the burden of greening our economy? Because that, for me, is for me, the social and the environment are never separated. And if you go to Brazil and you talk to people there, and if you go talk to people near the forest, unless there is, as Sir Tim said, unless there is a really viable, well thought through way of making a living, the argument of the short-sighted politicians and everybody else is that, oh, so you want these people to die, so let them burn the forest and sell the wood or put cattle in it. So there is this dichotomy almost between the social and the environmental, and actually there is never a dichotomy, because the only reason why we need to preserve our environment is because we want to still live in this planet. Because as Sir Tim gave the example, if we were okay to die, the planet will regenerate itself. It could take 10 years, 20, 200, it doesn't matter, you know? But the problem is we want to still live here. So we need to ensure that everything is done in a proper way. So when we think about, and I think sort of I have several more questions than answers, but I think, when we think about global warming, for example, it has to be an international effort, a collective effort. And the urgent questions that we have to answer is, which are the vested interests obstructing the switch to renewables? And how do we defeat them? How can we guarantee this just transition in which the poorest don't shoulder that burden of greening the economy? And what kind of international settlement would be needed to give this a global reach? And that's, again, is the issue of the Amazon, right? And others, of course. How do we ensure that the campaign for environmental justice is aligned with other social movements, like centered on race or gender or class, so that we don't create further inequality? And when I was thinking about this issue, coming here to the panel, the other thing that I was thinking, well, there are some things that are quite practical that we could do, right? So what about no more tax havens and closing the loopholes for tax dodging worldwide? What about companies stop lobbying against tougher climate action? What about instead creating industry alliances to press for wider systemic shifts, and actually press instead for government support for green innovation, policies to make existing clean technologies cheaper? We need an agreed framework as well for pricing carbon and pricing natural resources. And I completely agree with Sir Tim Smit that it's priceless, the experience that we have when we go and enjoy nature, and actually we reconnect poetically with ourselves and with our inner selves within that environment that reflects beauty for us, of who we are. But I think if we want this to scale, if we want this to work, we need to put a price on it. So if nothing else, to make the polluters very costly or unviable. And I think, yesterday there was the International Energy Agency published a report yesterday saying that we need to stop fossil fuel supply today. So it's like, we don't have any more time, and there is no need for it anymore. So, and finally, our pet project in Snowball, which is that financial systems need to report on risk, return, and impact. And that the impact of doing that, I think if we are seeing that we could invest in AstraZeneca that did the vaccine at cost, or in Pfizer that refused to do that, I think we would invest in AstraZeneca, right? So when you start to account for, the impact that different organizations are having, I think you will shift decisions as well. And the other thing that I thought is global government procurement is 13 trillion a year. If governments basically said, for a shortcut, let's only procure from B Corps, what change that would bring? I don't know. I'm just throwing stuff out there of thoughts that I had in terms of things we can do today if we were just willing.
So that's a lot of some really interesting analysis on the kinds of growth we don't want. Essentially, the binary, just the pure ones and zeros. We want to grow a sort of complexity of life and restore a complexity, a sort of nature's complexity of life. We want to grow with a pricing model that reflects resource use. And perhaps taxation systems that reflect resource use rather than income. But one question is, we're a community of marketers, and it's very interesting to hear an economist say that the problem with economics is that it's forgotten its poetry. I remember when I was an A-level student hearing an LSE professor say that he would rather have students who'd studied mathematics than economics, because it was the numbers and the processing of numbers that counted. But paradoxically, numbers tell a very easy story. You know, we've heard people say, I might be a bean counter, but I'd rather count more beans than fewer beans. So how do we really seed in a new sort of, as Tim Jackson might put it, cultural myth around prosperity that is as easy to understand and as easy for politicians to rally us around as the current drive for economic growth in that binary sense? I'm quite good at pulling silence into the group.
Paul, just a small tip for a host. It's generally, if you've got good-mannered people on it, tell someone that they're talking, or else everybody will shut up. Say to Tim, he's talking, and he'll give you a great answer. Go on, Tim.
What was the question again?
So how do we, if we need a new cultural myth, how do we seed that?
Yeah, right.
Put it powerfully in prosperity without growth. We need to stop spending money we don't have on things that we don't need to create impressions that don't last on people we don't care about. But economic growth is an easy story to tell. So how do we make growing prosperity as compelling a story and as easy a story as that across society?
Yeah, I mean, I think you tell a better story. That's my answer to that. I mean, prosperity without growth did, it laid down quite a lot, almost word for word, what Daniela just said just now, you know, in terms of the possible ways and the different things you could do. And I sort of summarized that in prosperity without growth by saying, you know, there's three broad things we have to do: establish the limits. And we've got a little bit better about that. We know what our emission pathways have to be to meet net zero and stay within a 1.5 budget. We know a little bit about where the boundaries of biodiversity are and what we have to do. Fix the economics, because they're really broken. You know, you've got a broken economics when you cannot afford to pay your nurses a decent wage to save your life. That is a broken economics. And change the social logic. And I suppose it's the bit about changing the social logic that you're sort of trying to draw me into. And that in a way was what the work that I hope post-growth a little bit has done, because I think there is a much better story. I think the story that capitalism tells us is a fraud. I think it's kind of gaslighting us to believe that the only way towards progress is to have power, to have money, to buy the things, as you say, to impress the people, etc., etc. And it's missing the core part of what it means to be human, that relationship aspect of being human, the care for one another and the care for the environment that we live in, the wonder and transcendence that comes from being in that environment, and the sense of purpose and action in the world that actually capitalism would much rather we didn't have. You know, capitalism will be happy if we just went out and bought stuff all the time, because that keeps all the people employed, that gives them the livelihood so they can go out buying the stuff. And the circle goes round and round, and out of that, some very clever people make an awful lot of money, gain an awful lot of power, and begin to build their own personal dreams of moving to other planets. And that is not a vision for everybody. And yet I passionately believe that there's a vision of the good life, which is much more, which is richer, which is more meaningful, which is more fulfilling. And we do not teach it to our kids. We do not encourage it in our students. We do not develop it as we move into our middle years. We don't keep at it as we go to our old age. We believe that comfort and the material possessions that make us more powerful in society is all there is. And there is no wisdom tradition in the world, there's no poetry in the world, there's no religion in the world that would accept that view of human psychology or the human spirit. There's no psychology in the world that really accepts that either. It's only economics. And I think this is where, you know, Sir Tim is right, that these kind of things have been coded into our myths in quite gendered ways sometimes, and sometimes in quite Western ways, and sometimes in quite individualized ways and atomized ways. And that's exactly what I think we have to tease apart and explore and say, that worked for a time, that worked for now, but it's not who we are. There is a better life, and that better life doesn't depend what the color of your skin is, or what gender you are, or how rich or poor you are. It depends on the ability to progress the boundaries of the human spirit and to develop our skills in the face of challenges. And sometimes as I said before, just to let things go. And it was very, very, very interesting when Daniela was talking about, kind of the fear of death. I think there is a fear of death that lies beneath capitalism. It's a sort of endless, restless attempt to stave off our own mortality. And we have to at some point to let that go. It's a bad story. We are mortal, we will die, and actually things will fall apart, and nature actually benefits sometimes from things falling apart. And if we move into the space which is more accepting of that narrative, which is truer to our real world, then maybe we'll find these visions of this better life that I passionately believe is there for everyone.
I think what's interesting in that, though, is our whole society at the moment is based on consumerism. And as you say, Tim, it's buying more stuff to show that you have the ability to buy more stuff. And a lot of the businesses that we as marketeers work for, at the heart of it is about selling more stuff. So I'd be interested to hear the panel's views about, as marketeers, as change leaders, how can we start to help change consumer behavior through marketing, through the organizations we're working with. And Sir Tim, I don't know whether through Eden, whether you're seeing consumers changing in their beliefs and their views when they're visiting the likes of the Eden Project, for example.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly easy to claim what you're changing. And if you're a marketeer, you will make a very good argument for how impactful you are. We've taken a very radical decision this year, having reread a book that I couldn't believe was as good as I thought it was when I first read it. I read it again, which is Buckminster Fuller's An Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. And I spoke to all my colleagues at Eden and I said, do any of us in this room think being the world's most successful man-made or human-made environment center in another 20 years' time is any measure of achievement? And we all agreed, no, it isn't. So we're turning ourselves inside out. Today is a very auspicious day. This morning at 9 a.m., our drills started going towards the center of the Earth with our geothermal project, and they're going down 4.7 kilometers. And they will give us superheated water with which we will be running Eden, and alongside our solar arrays, will make it such that we will be generating vast amounts of energy. But you know what's really depressing is the mediocrity of the visions. You say we're marketers, we're crap marketers. Really good marketers would say what clever little creatures we are as Homo sapiens. And if we can build amazing things, we can also come up with amazing solutions. I was struck today because we had the minister for COP26, Alok Sharma, there, and the stuff that's going in one side of his ears from all sorts of people who've got vested interests is extraordinary. We could, within 10 years, this nation could be completely energy independent, completely. Because what deep geothermal does is give you base load, which if you add it to solar and wind, which the problems and the arguments against them had always been that when it's not windy or it's night, they're not producing energy. And even if there was, the batteries aren't big enough. Well, with geothermal, you can. And with the price plummeting for drilling machinery as the fossil fuel demand goes, you're going to have a lot of equipment that you can hire to go really deep, which means that every square inch of these beautiful islands of ours could be generating renewable energy. It is a criminal shame that no one is standing up and saying, wouldn't it be good? I just wished a journalist had asked me the question, Tim Smit, you are a public Remainer. What would it take to have made you a Brexiteer? I wish I'd been asked that question. And you know what I'd have said? I'd have said, if you are going to sell me an idea that we can become renewable energy independent, that we can become completely food independent in a regenerative growing style, and we pump 40% of our national budget into education for the next 15 years, I'd have said, I'm with you. I think the trouble is that this sort of world that Tim is talking about is one that I think most people actually agree would be good. It's a really good world. The thing is, we hang on to our baggage in so many ways. I do, you do. A good example would be, for example, I would share with Tim my deep respect and love of the National Health Service. But you know what? I love this conversation because when you talk to people about the National Health Service, it's not possible to have a conversation anymore. You're not having a conversation. You're talking about your love and your aspiration and the fact there was this one great sentence, free healthcare at point of need. No one is daring to ask the question, how long do you want to live? How much pain do you want to have? Because there have been 2 royal commissions on the National Health Service over the last 25 years. They both came up with the same recommendation. Our system is completely broken. It is in all the wrong places, but because we're trying to protect every little provincial hospital and protect to do this, no one is saying, actually what you need to do is to build 30 fantastic hospitals that specialize in all the different parts of your body. And anybody, excuse me ladies for saying this, but anybody who's a guy who's ever had a prostate biopsy will tell you, if you go to a hospital where they only do 1 a month, it hurts a hell of a lot. You go to a place that does a dozen a day, and it's mercifully less painful. And I just think if we asked ourselves that question about, I'm joking really about myself here, but if we were brave enough to say, come on, if we forget jobs, all of those jobs are safe, but now what's the best system for us? I think that's a really interesting thing. And I think marketers, as that's what we are, we've got to be braver about telling a story that's actually worth aspiring to. We give ourselves 1% of this or 1% of that. We'll vote for that party that give us just a little bit more. You know, I just think we've got to be brave and bold in our vision for a future.
On the subject of storytelling, I mean, we often think of marketers as storytellers through big campaigns and so on. But of course, where we really learn to tell stories is when we're talking to people. And so one question I might like to put to Daniela is, in the world of finance, actually a very small number of people control massive flows of global finance. So if you could get the 20 biggest pension fund managers into a room and Daniela Barone Soaresify them, you know, what would you be most wanting to say to them?
I think the very first thing that I would say to them is forget the concept of fiduciary duty that the limited and limiting concept of fiduciary duty that you think you have, because the pension funds, they are okay. So why do they exist? They exist to hold on and invest the money so that teachers, nurses, and everybody else that works can retire and have a decent living after their retirement. And so far they define, and partly because of laziness, they define that fiduciary duty as, let me maximize the money that these people can get. However, the part of the problem with that is that if by the time you retire, if the world is horrible and you have to spend a lot more because the air is so polluted that you have to spend a lot of money on your health, or you're going to have a terrible quality of life, you know, then that fiduciary duty has not been achieved. So I think the first and foremost thing that I would say to them is to actually expand, and this conversation is very much happening you know, at the moment, but it hasn't really shifted yet. Expand the concept of fiduciary duty to include, you know, what is the world that when that person retires in 20-30 years, what is the world that we need to live in, and therefore how do we look at the kinds of investments that we should be doing so that that person not only has the ability to pay for their livelihood, to afford it, but also to enjoy, you know, their retirement in a world that can accommodate for that. So I think that would be my first, and, you know, the first thing, because they could move a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope that opportunity comes your way quickly. At MarketingKind, as Claire said earlier on, we're a very action-oriented group. And one of the things we have is every month a chance to upcycle our marketing skills in support of a good cause. And this month we're actually working with Scott Britton, the founder of Battle Cancer. And I'm not sure if he's with us. I would invite him to turn his camera on. Hi Scott, how are you?
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I wanted to be presenting on brand and on what we're doing, but thank you so much for just allowing me to sit and listen to the past hour. It's been incredibly insightful for someone who does not come from your world. So it's been been an absolute pleasure to listen. So thank you for letting me join before.
Awesome. And maybe you could give us a brief introduction to Battle Cancer, and also a quick sense of how we may be able to help you in this month's Coffee with a Cause.
Yeah, and actually, listening to a number of the things that people on the panel have talked about from a charitable purpose, it was born out of raising money for various different charities. On an individual side, I was actually quite bad at doing that, and found that actually by bringing people together under one common cause through fitness, so everything we do is through fitness, managed to exponentially increase the amount of fundraising that my time and output could do. So from previously doing 1 year, we had one event that was based around functional fitness movements for a mass market, where a lot of current events that engage people are sport specific, or they stop people due to a limiting factor of either their loss of a limb, previous experience, where they currently are in their own physical journey. And what Battle Cancer does is create mass participation events where the focus is on accessibility, but also to have a side. So we actually have our own charity where we provide fitness classes for people post-cancer treatment, and woven into that, we use the World Health Organization's quality of life questionnaire to readdress both purpose and self-identity for somebody who's undergone cancer treatment, and how they view themselves, how they view society, their need to rely on medication to act on a day-to-day basis. So we have about 15,000 people partake in our events, and they fundraise through third-party platforms for any cancer charity that they wish to fundraise for. And they undergo 4 fitness challenges on the day to do that. I started Battle Cancer about 4 years ago. My previous career was in the police force, so I'd worked as a detective sergeant on serious crime for about 9 years. So it was a little bit of a different world to go into, trying to mass market events, to have brand partnerships, to launch a charity. Has been lots of learning experiences. So the fantastic opportunity to present in front of yourselves and hopefully get some feedback is, as we've grown, we now host events in 7 different countries, but a significant area that we're lacking compared to commercial events, so events that are not even centered around fundraising, is how they successfully promote their event and associated fundraising through big corporates, and how they attract both branding partnerships with those corporates, and how they activate the power and wealth that sits within corporate wellness and the marketing machine that sits behind big corporate brands. So far Battle Cancer has worked with niche fitness brands. We've managed to never spend a penny of ad spend. We've never employed anybody to do that yet. On a monthly, we reach 1.2 million people through social media. We've got a database of 30 to 40,000 people. And as I say, we've got 15,000 people that interact with our events. However, I am fully aware that, the professional marketers that make this phenomenal group will hopefully be able to shed some light into the curtain that we call the corporate Wizard of Oz. So that's a problem that we've had that we'd love to get some support from.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Scott. If you're a MarketingKind member, then do join us on May 28th, 11 to 12:30 for the Coffee with a Cause with Scott. Brilliant opportunity to support an inspiring project, to use fitness to drive inclusive wellness, probably to learn how to get ripped in the process. If you're not a MarketingKind member, then please correct that very quickly. But if you can't correct it and you have some other way to help Scott, then please just drop us a line and we'll introduce you and get you started. So thank you so much, Scott. We're going to include questions from our Q&A as well as pre-submitted questions. So I think Anna has been reminding people in the chat that they can post their questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat, so that it's easier for us to see. And just before we move on to those, I wanted to say, as we're emerging from lockdown, a lot of people may not want to be going overseas on holiday. And I would encourage everyone to consider visiting the Eden Project instead. It's a life-enhancing, potentially life-changing project. From my visit to Eden, Tim, the thing that stuck with me was actually when I had the chance to meet the group of people that clean the toilets. And they gave an inspiring presentation where they talked about having taken the mission of sustainability so to heart that they taught themselves how to use the architect's CAD software so that they could go into designs for new buildings at Eden and, based on their cleaning experiences, make small changes to the design over where electric sockets were and so on to enhance the efficiency of the cleaning process. And I think if you want a group of people that are really engaged with a mission and a purpose, it's very hard to find something better than Eden. I also want to recommend Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism. As Tim has already alluded, you might pick this up in the hope of understanding how we can build prosperity in challenging times. You might put it down having had new thoughts about how to come to terms with your own mortality. So it's a really inspiring read, and as a marketer, to come to a book from an economist and to be inspired afterwards to go and pick up Anna Arendt for my bedtime reading, it's definitely an engaging read. And you can also, if you're more economically minded in the conventional sense, read Prosperity Without Growth and hopefully give it more due consideration than when it landed on Gordon Brown's desk at what it seems was an unfortunate day for it to first arrive. But I'll let people look into the backstory of that for themselves. For Daniela, I think at the moment you might need quite deep pockets to invest in Snowball, but as Daniela alluded to, there's a hope that there will be a retail proposition at Snowball in the not too distant future. So it may be a place that we can put our pocket money or retirement savings if we're lucky enough to accrue them at some point in time. So let's go to Q&A. And I wonder, Claire, if you might like to get us going.
Yeah, I've picked up on a couple. First of all, there's a good question from Giles that is framing the question, is ESG potentially the new greenwash? And I think that picks up on the comments that have been made about, is it just risk mitigation rather than actually looking at impact? So Daniela, that's probably one for you to start off on.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So ESG is better than not ESG. So let's start with that. Right, so taking the environment, social, the social considerations into account have led to some positive changes. But in my view, if we think ESG is going to save the world, we're damned. So ESG is better than the alternative, but is not good enough to bring the transformation that we need both in society and the environment.
Yeah.
Did you say there were a couple?
Yeah, no, there's a few in the chat about picking up on how we've talked about economic success being a lot of people's drivers. So there's a question that says, isn't it harder to tell someone from a disadvantaged socioeconomic background not to want more and strive for financial success? How does one get the balance right on building a narrative of a better life whilst also levelling out inequality? Tim Jackson, I don't know if that's one that you would be interested in picking up on.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think it's right. I mean, actually, one of the metaphors that I use in Post-Growth is the idea that prosperity is about health ultimately, and it's in physical terms. That's a very fundamental thing to say, but it's also about the health of the planet. It's also about the health of our relationships, the health of our community. And there's an interesting thing about health, which is it's broadly driven by a metaphor not of endless growth, but of balance. And actually, when you have too little, you need more. And the evidence that I looked at, particularly in Prosperity Without Growth, shows that very, very clearly. You get these huge increases in prosperity when you increase the wealth of the poorest countries in the world, when you increase the wealth of the poorest people in the world. So that's absolutely right. And I think the last thing you do is to get on your soapbox and tell people who haven't got anything that they're never going to have it. I mean, it's just immoral. There's no case for it whatsoever. What I do think you need to do, if you're someone with political power, with any kind of influence, is you go to those people and you say, yes, you need the decent universal basic services that will give you that decent life. And you also need these other opportunities, that will allow you to have a long and fulfilling life in a way that you can never have if you're drawn into the mire of consumerism. And so to me, you know, those two things go together absolutely. There is no moral case for telling people not to consume more when they are poor. There's a huge moral case for people who are already rich actually to think about transforming the system in that country and to make it one that's fairer, that does, and I hate to use the term because of who it belongs to, but levels up, if you like, but doesn't just level up material conditions, levels up opportunity, levels up the places where actually we have the potential for this richer life. And that's something, and I said this before, and the more that I think about it, and I've thought about it a lot since writing Post-Growth, it's incredibly accessible, this idea of the progress of the human spirit. It is not something that depends on your level of income. It's not something that depends on your access to material goods. It's not something that depends on your access to capital. You always have these abilities, these places where it's possible to pursue this idea of the human spirit. And I'm not meaning that to be in a kind of panacea way. I'm not trying to say, well, you poor people haven't got anything, so, you know, try the human spirit for size. That's a real upper. It's not, it's absolutely acknowledging that poverty sucks, and it sucks not just for the people in it, but for the rest of society. But it's also about saying there are different kinds of poverty. There are material poverties, and there are poverties, as Robert Kennedy said, of dignity and purpose and meaning. There are poverties of poetry. There are poverties of understanding. And actually, there is no one who would not benefit from recognizing and relieving those poverties.
There's an interesting follow-up to that actually in the chat as well from Jackie Peacock saying, shouldn't we be talking to those hardest hit by our current system, explaining the reasons and getting the strength of numbers and calling for change, which I think follows up on your point, Tim, about actually that, you know, poverty is not where we want anyone to be, and there feels like there could be a mass calling to get that storytelling into a broader group of people.
Yeah, I would just add to that, if I may, Claire, also that those people were the people that we relied on most through the pandemic, the people who actually have had their livelihoods suffer over decades because of the very structure of capitalism, are precisely the place we should start when we think about post-pandemic recovery.
Absolutely. It wasn't the hedge fund managers that kept London going when the pandemic was raging.
I'm going to put a couple of questions together in one. So Paul Twivy's sent in a question ahead of time. Do we think the current obsession with purpose in business is a genuine force for good or just woke washing? And I might add to that, we've had several questions on the subject of stakeholder capitalism. And is that a valid alternative, or is that also potentially a sort of fairly diluted form of woke washing? So as I'm going to follow Sir Tim's advice in putting, so I'm going to go to Sir Tim with that question, and anybody else who would like to also comment.
Yes.
Yes, it's woke
washing. To be honest, the things that you're not allowed to say that are really worth saying are those of us who believe in social enterprise ought to be honest that one of the real problems is that a lot of people who are involved in social enterprise would like to be seen as really good people because they're involved in social enterprise. There's a kind of positioning that because it's a really worthwhile thing that we ought to respect you. I've met more incompetence in the world of social enterprise than I've met anywhere else. Honestly, I have. And there is a real problem in terms of getting people to understand. It's when I was in the music industry, I always used to lose my temper with the guitarist. He always used to say, hey man, I'm an artist. I don't want to learn about business. And I used to just swear at them and say, well, go on, starve, and I'll enjoy watching you. You've got to take responsibility for your life. And when I see the mediocrity of people who talk about a social enterprise vision of the world and they don't understand how to run a business, they don't understand how to consult with people. Even worse, you then get the problem, oh, let's ask everybody who's badly off, how are we going to do this, right? It's a bit like the Henry Ford thing, saying if I'd asked people what they wanted, I'd have been asked for a faster horse. You actually need something we really need, and maybe you guys would be really good at this, would be horizon scanning to provide in the social medium the best examples of what is best practice everywhere in the world, so that when you talk to people who are badly off, who want to say, give them the palette of amazing things that's happening all over the world, so they can go, wow, I hadn't thought of that. I like that. I like a bit of that. I like a bit of that. Actually, I've now got a really different idea altogether, inspired by having seen what all these things are. I just think the intelligence that's locked up, say, in a group like this, needs to be released from the correctness, the wokeness, as you put it, of this kind of faux idealism about the ability of the noble savage, the underprivileged person, to understand how to get out of it. Really, I don't. I've now probably never been invited back, but I'm just said what I think.
It's your willingness to say what you think, I think, is why you do get invited to places, and why I can often remember things you've said quite a few years after you've said them. I wonder, Claire, are there further...
Can I just say one thing around stakeholder capitalism? Because I think there is an interesting kernel of a good idea there, which is restoring the corporate purpose in a genuine way. Meaning, you know, why do companies exist to begin with? Why are we here to begin with? Why are we doing what we're doing to begin with? And again, you know, I'm not talking about the nth soap that you don't need, but talking about things like the stories that I tell. You know, the story of Shark Solutions, which found a way to separate plastic compounds from glass so that both can be reused and nothing goes to waste. The story of Opticon, which hires autistic people for their professional services. The story of Fair for You, which supports people to buy essential goods so they don't have to resort to loan sharks. The story of Olio, that prevents food waste. And food waste is globally responsible for 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So I think these are stories of as you were just saying, Sir Tim Smit, of inspirational businesses that are thinking beyond my little thing of selling stuff, but actually have a broader implication into the world. And I think when you start to think of a broader stakeholder group, as you think about your company or whatever, then you naturally start to kind of to broaden that purpose and to think more purposefully. So there is something to do. I think there is something good in it. What I think is a fallacy is to expect that companies are going to save the world. They're not, you know. So let's not go that far. It has to be everything and everyone. It's a systemic, you know, it's a systemic combination of people, of culture, of movement, of wealth distribution, of companies, government policies, regulation, things that people don't want to hear about, but yes. So I think, yeah, I'll stop.
Well, can I just enter that little conversation, because I thought it was fascinating, because in a way, Daniela, you were kind of saying, well, companies are not going to save us, and in a way, Tim, you were saying social enterprise isn't going to save us. Is there a model of enterprise that somewhere would reach a place where being a purposeful enterprise in the service of society is not just wokeism? I mean, do you see a rescue strategy for social enterprise, or a rescue strategy for profit-driven enterprises?
I definitely do. The point I was making was slightly different. I think one of the things that we all ought to be looking at is how do we give the skills to people doing the things we want to be able to broker the relationships, because so many. Tim, I know from having heard you speak, one of the most heartbreaking things is the amount of assets lying around everywhere that, if they were put together, would create enormous value. I don't know whether this is true. I just wish it, I hope it is, because it just should be. That if you look in the attics and garages and backyards of every home in Britain, you have enough wealth to rebuild the British education system. But also, if you then add to that pile the skills and talents of people not being brought to the table, that's the greatest waste of all. I found at Eden that it makes me quite teary sometimes. The most powerful address to people is to people over the age of 50 who are longing and weeping for the person they dreamt they were going to be when they were 19 and feel disappointed by what they've become. Give people of a certain age the chance to actually be that person again by offering an opportunity and a stage to play on. You can transform anything. Honestly, I've seen it. So I'm very pro social enterprise, and I'm very anti talking in a library hush of respect about it for people who don't have the talent to run it properly. I think if you can run a great social enterprise, you ought to be able to run any type of company. That's all I'm really saying. And just to end, I think there are a lot of social enterprises that could be started. And one of the ones we haven't got time, but I've heard you talk about farming and food production as a muscular localism in terms of how you re-center food and farming. And that's an incredible area. If I was given £1,000 for every person under the age of 30 who's approached me for, could you let me get into farming? Could you let me get into growing? Could you teach me how to produce stuff? I'd be a multi-millionaire. You know, I mean, what I'd love would be if Tim got up and said, I think we should give £600 million from the National Lottery to buy some land off those rich bastards and actually start giving some land to people to actually get some experience on the soil.
Just picking up, there's a couple of questions in the chat actually that just pick up on the comment you just made, Daniela, about everybody having to pull together, and there's two differing views on the role of government on this. One question from David Jury, which is talking about asking how much do the panelists agree or disagree with Paul Collier's characterization of the future of capitalism, that we need an active state that adopts a more modest role, and we need markets to be grounded in ethics. Highly pertinent today where ethics in public life have been eroded. And then another comment from Martin Utley is talking about how do we fix the government failures that ultimately have framed the market? Because if we just focus on business, we need to focus on government as well. Business is not just the answer, which I think, Daniela, you talked about, but it's an interesting view about where is the government's role in this and what should they be doing? Daniela, I don't know if you've got a view on that.
I think if we start going to sort of binary, sort of left and right, state versus market, left versus right, all of those limiting definitions in a way. I think it sort of try to sort of reduce the size of the question that we're trying to address, in a sense. So I don't know the size of the state. I think that is I don't know. I think what I do think is that the state and policies, as well as markets and finance, need to be looking and planning much more longer term. This obsession with short-termism, this obsession with everything tomorrow. And again, the politicians have the same, they're looking for their re-election cycles and they're just looking to keep themselves in power. That's what prevents them of addressing things that are quite profound, systemic, and hard to address. I'll give you an example. I used to work in a nonprofit organization, and one of the things that we did was work with ex-offenders. And the issue in the prison system and ex-offenders is totally fixable. And it's a massive issue. It's a waste. Talk about waste of human potential. Because we lock people in, we free them out, we give them no opportunity, they go straight back in. It's a waste of money, it's a waste of talent, it's a waste of human potential. And the reality is the fruits of any intervention there will be only felt 20 years from now. It's a long-term intervention, and nobody has the political courage to do what is needed, because the Daily Mail is going to say that we're being soft on criminals. So this is part of the problem that we face, I think. So if we start thinking about, having almost a common plan for what is the kind of society we want to see, and then articulate this plan, whether it is us, as consumers, the power that we have. I know we can, we can have, we vote with our feet every day, but also our civic engagement, from companies, from government. I think that's where we need to go. So I don't have an exact answer to this question, but I think sort of short-termism is a massive deficiency that blocks us from having that bigger, longer-term vision.
Yeah. And I think another question that's come up actually, which is about this longer term vision and investing for the future. And Sir Tim, this is probably an interesting one for you. It's from Sarah Winnington, who says, but the progress of the human spirit requires an educational system to support this. So what needs to change within our educational system?
Crikey, I'm going to give the answer that Tim Jackson was giving about the National Health Service. First of all, you've got to increase. Ken Robinson was on my board until he sadly died last year. And he said, I would be a billionaire if I got £1,000 for every person who suggested a new curriculum. The issue isn't the curriculum, it is the way you look at the world and the way you treat and value the education system in the first place. And we've got a mechanistic industrial revolution type education system run by bells, which is rather antithetic to creativity. There are lots of great teachers. There are brilliant kids. Anybody who teaches at all will just feel quite optimistic about the future. But there is something that is at its heart wrong, which is that if to survive, you should have to be able to grow something and then afterwards be able to cook it. Why is that less important than understanding the kings and queens of England? I've always found this the most extraordinary thing in our country, the way we want to inflict an education on our children, which was the same that was inflicted on us. I do quite a lot of thinking about certain issues. I like the idea of taking us as 100 people. If everybody on this call was in a village, right, and we were the world, and we put a wall around us, and we then asked everybody inside the wall, what do we need in this place? Yeah, what do we need in this place? Well, we need a few people up on the wall to stop the wolves and hyenas getting us. We need some people to move the manure around and to feed us. And so they've all got a job. You add up the cost of all the things that we, the citizens, have asked for, and it will come to 3 times more than we will ever be able to pay in tax. So we go, now isn't that really interesting? If I did this in my town of Wadebridge, which I have actually had this discussion here in Wadebridge where I live, the truth is we can only have what we want if we remind ourselves we are also citizens. Foremost, we are citizens, not consumers. And actually, if we then said, okay, I tell you what, I will mow the lawn and I will paint the road stripes and I will do that. And then my neighbor does this, and you add it all up, and then eventually you get to something you can afford. I think that's exactly what the education system that we need is about not seeing what can I give you in order to make you a valuable commodity. It is what can we all learn together in schools that actually find the elements in us that are really positive to draw out the things that we can be successful in. And then what can we do that make us really good citizens? You know, like how to get on with our fellow human beings, which is another thing that we don't seem to teach in schools. But, you know, you've asked the wrong person this question. You should have asked Tim below me. Wrong Tim. But anyway, that was my answer.
No, it was my answer. You gave it really well. Thanks, Tim.
So etymologically, of course, prosperity is essentially a story of hope. And if there's something that people want right at this point in time, it's a story of hope that we can use to climb our way out of what has been an inconvenience for some people and a monstrous experience for other people. So maybe we have to draw to a close soon, but maybe you could each have a word on what most gives you hope right now at this point in time that you'd like to share with our community. I'll start with Tim Jackson, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think it's, I guess, in the last chapter of Post-Growth, I talk a lot about Emily Dickinson, and one of her poems starts the chapter, and it goes like this: hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tunes without the words and never stops at all. And there's something really comforting about that, because what it suggests is that hope is not something we have to go striving for or searching for. It's actually there, and it's always kind of with us. And I think in that way, kind of in a sense, freeing ourselves from the pursuit of hope allows us a different response to despair. And here is my kind of starter for 10 on that, actually, that the antidote to despair is not actually hope. It's definitely not false optimism. It's not a chimera of, simple wins and silver bullets. The antidote to despair is action. And if you can find a place where action exists, then you don't necessarily need to worry about where hope is.
Very good.
Beautiful. Maybe Daniela, it sounds like that resonates with you.
Hard act to follow after this beautiful, beautiful definition.
You're all impossible acts to follow, but I know that you can also cultivate a sense of hope, because I've experienced that talking to you previously. So what hope can you share at this point?
I think the hope I have is the fact that from my day-to-day job, seeing companies that are thinking about purpose, because otherwise they can't attract talent, which means that talent is looking for purpose, that people are beginning to look for purpose, that this idea that I have to park my values at the door and come to work, or I have to park my values and invest, or I have to park my values anywhere. So for me, that gives me a lot of hope. Movements that are converging into something, we don't know yet, but from EU taxonomy that is trying to kind of at least make it really hard for greenwash in terms of investing. People in the impact ecosystem that are trying to make it really hard for people to fake impact. Movements like Make My Money Matter that are trying to educate people about, how that they have pensions and that they can have a voice about their pensions and how these pensions are invested. And there's awareness about, where are my products coming from, what are the things that I'm doing, increase people becoming vegetarian and vegans because they are more aware of the impact that has in the environment. And I think the conversations that we've started to have around race, which is a topic that people did not dare touch. And I think what a horrible incident that crystallized this conversation, but what a beautiful opportunity to start talking about equity. This is a term that I heard a long time ago, and yet, when you talked about it, people were saying, no, it's about equality of opportunity. And that's exactly what it is, actually, but people don't understand that the system is rigged against a lot of people just by nature. So I think we are having some difficult conversations. It has been a pleasure to have this conversation, and I think we need to have more conversations around that. And I'll stop here. There's a lot more that I could say, but I'll stop here. But I think that gives me hope. All of those things give me hope.
So Tim, we have about 60 seconds before we'll have to draw to a close. So what's your brief injection of hope into the community that we care about here at MarketingKind?
Okay, loved what the other two said. My definition of hope is that when in 1969, I heard that we are all stardust and it was hippie shit. Today, when I see what British medicine and American medicine is finding about the microbiome in our stomachs, and what the great researchers are discovering what's going on in the mycorrhiza of the fungal in the soil, the fungi in the soil, and realize how closely these things are all related, I think we're about to have a spiritual revolution in which all young people on earth are going to suddenly realize we are creatures, we are earthlings, and to actually realize that will change our whole approach to living within the confines of the planet.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we did say radical and practical, and what big visions.
Yeah, so thank you, all three of you, for coming along this evening. I know your time is very precious, but we really are grateful for Daniela and both Tims for all that you've shared today, and also, above all, for being such inspiring leaders. And the chat has been, certainly a lot of people have been left this call inspired after the conversation today. So thank you. And thank you to everyone else for joining us and participating in the questions and the chat. As Paul said before, we don't just want to be a spectator on these issues. So if you're not a member of MarketingKind, please do join us. We have several of these events which are inspiring and helping us to look at different ways of doing business. And just a very quick reminder before we go of the upcoming events for MarketingKind. We've got Coffee with a Cause in support of Battle Cancer, which you just heard from Scott, coming up on May the 28th at 11 o'clock. There is a Your Marketing Kind event on June the 9th with thoughts on the value of professional extracurricular activity with Direct Line Group Managing Director of Marketing and Digital and another founding member of MarketingKind, Mark Evans. And in our next exchange, Paul will be leading a discussion on June the 16th, exploring how we can build resilience through the private sector, government and civil society. And the panelists for that exchange will be Harvard economist Professor Rebecca Henderson, former Minister with responsibility for the UK's resilience, Sir Oliver Letwin, and Rita Chadha, CEO of the Small Charities Coalition. So that promises to be an incredibly inspiring and interesting exchange as well. Obviously, all the events are on the MarketingKind website, marketingkind.org. So it just leaves me to say thank you so much for everyone being involved, the three panelists, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.